This time we're in the zone, we're going with the flow. Meet Bob Mosher, the workflow learning guy, and his 5 moments of L&D need. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
When Josh Bersin proclaimed learning in the flow of work as a new training paradigm in 2018, our guest this time on The Learning Hack, Bob Mosher, had already been talking about it for 17 or more years. Bob drew on the work of Gloria Geary and her seminal 1992 book, Electronic Performance Support Systems, so it goes back even further. Kate Fitzgerald, head of FACT, tell us about this ahead of his time guy.
Hack facts.
Bob Mosher has been an active and influential leader in the learning and training industry for over 30 years and is renowned worldwide for his pioneering role in new approaches to learning. Based in South Carolina, Bob is CEO and Chief Learning Evangelist at Apply Synergies. Previously, he was with Microsoft as Director of Learning Strategy and Evangelism, a global business at Microsoft Corporation featuring innovative learning products. Bob is also a Maisie Fellow representing the Performance Support Thought Leadership Learning area as an advisor to the Maisie Centre.
Learning in the flow of work is hardly a new idea, but it seems that it's only just beginning to receive the sort of attention that would make it a reality within organisations. I wanted to know why this apparently simple concept had proved so difficult to implement, so I asked Bob. Jay Curtis, Head of Themes. What else did we talk about?
Bob is famous, among other things, for the 5 moments of L&D need concept, which he explains in your interview. But another major theme you explored was how you might implement workflow learning in an organisation and what technology is most useful. Turns out, workflow learning, as he tells it, is less a particular set of technologies and more a mindset. The LearnTech industry doesn't always get it right, it seems, but the core of it lies in the cognitive state of the learner.
If your learner has to leave their flow state in order to think about learning something, then you're not doing it right, was my takeaway. But that was just one of a number of fascinating nuggets that Bob had to share. So welcome to The Learning Hack, Bob Mosher. You're known as the workflow learning guy. Hate to pigeonhole you like that, but it's kind of the way the world is. And key part of your thought is the 5 moments of need, which you formulated together with Conrad Gottfredson.
Mm-hmm.
The 5 moments of need are pretty well known, but just for people who are new to L&D or maybe haven't been paying attention, can you briefly summarize the 5 moments of needs for us?
Certainly. These are Khan's great work, candidly, of his life work. And it was introduced to me about 20 years ago, frankly, in my learning journey as an L&D professional. And I was attempting to do some blended learning that had gone a little south. And so I talked to Khan about where I had missed it. And so to your question, he said, here's the reality is that for a lot of times L&D does what he calls a content pivot. And thinks rearranging content is what gets you blended learning. And his argument, and I learned then, was that there is a content, but there's also a context pivot that should also go on not just the content the learner needs, but the context in which they need that content, right? And so he explained to me this wonderful, very simple principle of that through his work, he had realized that a learner has 5 moments of need with which that content needs to be blended or virtualized or anything. And of course, it's when someone knows nothing, they have to be schooled up on what is new. That's moment 1. And then historically, once I know stuff, I may want to know more new stuff. And I have a foundation upon which to grow that new information upon, right? So that's what we call more learning. So there's new, and then of course there's more. And historically, those have been treated very well with formal instruction as we know it. And where my blended effort at the time went awry was where I was missing was that he said, well, there's also taking all of that and contextualizing it through trying to apply. And that's the moment 3. And for many learners, by the way, probably the one they deal with every day of work. And then there's derivatives of apply. Moment 4 is that, well, things change And therefore, I have to not just apply what I just learned, I have to apply a new version of what I know. And so there's the world of change. And then lastly, learners get themselves in trouble. They wander into waters they shouldn't, or they think they knew how to do something and then they really don't. And so they have to back out of a circumstance, not enter it, which the first four really are about. And how do I troubleshoot and reconceptualize through the moment of solve? So new, more, apply, change, and solve.
Right. So those 5 moments kind of break down into two groups. 1 and 2 are probably what we most often associate with what the training department does.
Yep.
3, 4, and 5, probably the stuff that most easily gets overlooked.
Agreed.
What I sort of wondered about was change. And now, are you talking there really about personal change or organizational change? Because change, as we know, has been a big thing over the last 20 years or so. An industry of its own, in a way, with a philosophy. Do you hook into that with it, or is it more about individual change?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, it frankly kind of goes across, and the pandemic has, I think, accelerated the personal change side of things for a lot of people, right? Yeah. They're like we talked about before this recording started, that you've seen people's homes in this journey of late, right? And their family wandering behind them. And I've been on business meetings with clients, and I hear a 4-year-old, all of a sudden in the background, right? So clearly a lot of personal change. And that has, I think, accelerated things lately, but organizational change. And then along with that is the degree to which, my gosh, organizations are changing. Look at our reaction to the pandemic, right? Lockdown, not lockdown, 50%, 25% capacity. I mean, my gosh, that's not an organizational change. It's not a structural change. That also ripples down to how does my team then perform? And who do I report to anymore? And all those kinds of things. So yeah, change is it's been interesting because over the 20 years that I've known the methodology, a common question is, is one ahead of the other lately? And I would absolutely, for a while, apply was always the winner. But I would absolutely say, John, that now change has moved to the head of the crowd. And how do we keep learners up with change? Khan has always said that adults unlearning to relearn, which is the approach to handling change, is the hardest cognitive jump for an adult to do, because we become set in wanting to do things consistently. Yeah. And a child, every day is new, but an adult prides themselves on structure, consistency, and knowing. So that's a very, very challenging need to meet of late in particular.
Yeah, I suppose I could echo that. I've just moved house, and I think the hardest thing is throwing stuff away. Which when we moved house, we realized is something we consistently hadn't done over the last 30 years.
Right. Well, it's funny, John. I mean, when I just moved recently in my area too, and talk about, unlearning, I drove back to my old apartment 3 times. Right. Because it was just so automatic to take the right turn, left turn, and so on. Right. And so simple examples, but magnify that by the world we live in today from a work perspective. And it's a challenge.
That last example is interesting because on a previous edition of the podcast, somebody was talking about, I think it was Julie Dirksen was talking about cognitive load and the stuff that we do completely automatically. And driving home is one of those. People will get to the end of having driven home from work and have no memory at all of the intervening time when they were driving. And when you move house, of course, you have to change. So
yeah, well, automaticity is the theoretical definition of that. When doing something has moved beyond conscious thought, and I think it's an adult nature and learning behavior to want to do that, and so to undo that and learn something new is really a challenge for a lot of folks today. And again, at the pace of how it's happening now, it's really been accelerated.
So the idea of the 5 moments, you said it's 20 years old. I thought it was 10 years old just because the deck I downloaded was 10 years old, but 20 years, that's been around with that. And the concept of electronic performance support systems, which you also talk a lot about, which you credit to Gloria Geary, that comes from 1990s.
1991.
1991, yeah. So in that whole time during which learning in the flow of work has not just been a new fad, but has really been a feature of the landscape in L&D, What progress have you seen among practitioners towards being more just in time, just enough, and just for me?
Yeah, and I think I love the way you said that, John, because I think we ran it just in time first, because e-learning and LMS could bring things to people just in time. I can sit while I'm sitting here with you. I can go off and find my LMS and launch it and search down a course. I think that was the first evolution of the steps towards workflow learning. But what I think Gloria would argue about and maybe defend is that accessibility doesn't get you the just for me, just enough. I hear these other things added to that I don't think we have done as well. And I think that's where Gloria's original vision in 1991, which is I think a landmark book in our industry. I think it should be required reading of any L&D professional. Even though it's a bit dated now in 1991, but there are things in there that I don't think we're doing today, because I think we got distracted. And I want to be careful here, because I don't think it was the intent or bad, but I think we got distracted by the success of what e-learning and the internet and those kinds of things got us. And then I think she would argue we went way ahead of what we got for that. And so the EPSS got sort of dropped to the wayside as a technology and as a methodology, which any technology needs, I think, and I would argue, to be successful, because we spent so much time uploading courses and putting them into our LMSs, and a whole billion-dollar industry emerged with e-learning content and e-learning authoring environments. But I would argue that, having been in that and now being very involved in the use of EPSS, is that they are not one and the same. And an EPSS is really what gets you the just for me, just enough. That, again, I want to be careful. I don't think that the LMS has done anything wrong, but if you look at them, they don't do those things by their nature. And that's okay. To your point, they meet moments 1 and 2, I would argue, very well, but they do not. It's unfair to them to say that and I think that's what's happened. A learner says, look, I got these other needs. I went to my LMS and it was terrible. Yeah. I was trying to fix something and I went to this 600 catalog thing that I couldn't, well, you went to it for the wrong need, and one, it didn't pretend to meet. And now you go to an EPSS, workflow oriented, that kind of thing, role based. And guess what? You found the asset quicker. So I think that's where the confusion has come, and why Gloria's work was distracted, I think, and derailed. But I think why now it is also so important, because of the world we live in and the needs of the learners we discussed a moment ago.
Are we beginning to get there now? Are you seeing in the kind of in the behaviour and the talk of L&D that they're taking this on board more? Obviously you're a very popular speaker. I saw you at Learning Technologies before the lockdown started, and there was a real buzz about you, and people said, you've got to go see Bob Mosher. Are the ideas being put into practice, do you feel? I
think, John, they finally are. And with my gray hair here, I can tell you I've been around a long time. This is my 38th year in this industry, right? Longer than some of your listeners probably been on this planet. And if I've learned anything, from my sage on the stage, it's that our industry is risk averse. We are steeped in learning theory that's wonderful, because I think we have a responsibility to be. At the same time, I think we're slow to change, and so I've learned that you can't thrust a technology like EPSS on someone if the industry isn't ready. Learners aren't ready, and I think, to your question, I think the pandemic has accelerated. It's 2 words I've heard out of this thing from L&D professionals: is acceleration and opportunity. Because difficult times call for difficult measures, and you have a different receptivity from people when they feel backed into a corner, as opposed to when they're comfortable and things are fine. And so, I think it's exploded because of that. And the timing is where I think a tool that Gloria proposed in 91, which seemed Star Wars back then, is really very relevant today.
So let's talk about the tools a little bit. And in addressing that last question, I think about how much progress we've seen through a slightly different lens. To the extent that learning in the flow of work has to be technology mediated, and I think
Sure.
it does, because in a way the concept starts with the existence, or at least the potential existence of the technology to do it. Is the vendor community, the people who build learning systems, are they building the right sort of stuff to support workflow learning, in your view?
I think it's funny to say something that started in 91 is an emerging discipline, right? But again, I want to be awful careful. I think, understandably, the thing that fit the time best were LMSs, because I was a part of building e-learning back in 1991 or two. And once we got beyond 3, 4 courses, 10 courses, the learner went, well, wait a second, can we put these somewhere where I can find them well, or be directed better, or be graded on them, or my manager knows if I took it? All those natural questions came out of that. And so we had to get that correct. But to your point, I think so all those large vendors understandably emerged, and should have. It's exciting because we follow 5 or so in our work. And again, I don't want to pigeonhole that, because that's our view, but that are really on top of this and building an EPSS specific technology. I think a lot of vendors will say they do it, but I would argue that they don't all. But I think it comes back to what the definition of what one does, right? And so if you look at Gloria's definition in 91 of what she envisioned EPSS to do, which I think is defendable to this day, I don't know if an LMS falls in that category. So I think they are catching up. They're still seen as peripheral, still, in my opinion. But they are getting a lot more attention than they ever have, frankly.
So are LXPs any more helpful, do you think?
I think they're the next derivative. I think, again, if I may, for this podcast, I always be careful. This is through the lens of the world that I see in my work and so on. Is I think that they are finding they're taking an LMS has always sort of pivoted on an event-based mentality, a learning object like an e-learning course, right? Or other things, or now a virtual course, and we can schedule other things in there. LXP realized that in a learner's journey, there are a lot of experiences that should qualify for support and learning as well. And notice I use 2 words, support and learning, because to a learner, they want both, right? And so LXPs have tried to get their arm around what is the broader learning experience that we should be able to make available to our learners, not just limited by the course idea, the course mentality. Yeah. So I think they're a step closer. I think there's some things they're missing from a contextual perspective still, to be honest. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. I would agree.
And another thing that we're seeing is because of the kind of ubiquity of APIs nowadays, is linking into platforms like Teams and Slack.
Yes, yes, and that's what an EPSS should do, John. In my
I think it's slightly misleading to talk about LXP as an experience layer in my view, because with these kind of integrations, the experience layer becomes Teams or Slack.
Yeah, well, we've proposed for years what Con and I have called the performance support pyramid, sort of a hierarchical view of how in the workflow learners want to see resources architected, right? And so you said it brilliantly. It's not just a learning object they want. Sometimes they want a reference object, and that is, I would argue, a very different object, like a job aid. A job aid's never been meant to teach, but an e-learning or a 5-minute YouTube might be designed completely instructional. Step 1, step 2, step 3, some background context. Watch me do this. A job aid doesn't pretend to ever do that, right? But it can be a very immediate and powerful reference material. Okay, so Teams, a colleague, in my opinion, falls in the support learning resource bucket. So how do I get to them at the right time and quickly, so that I can talk to Mary, Mark, or Joe but I also want to be able to know that picking Mary's the right resource because Mary has the expertise in the area I want help in, not Joe or the others, right? So that I think the LXP and others have pushed us into wanting to understand it, that the danger here is making more things available isn't the learner will be the first to tell you, no, SharePoint did that badly in some cases years ago. Let's not go there again. But more would be great if it's architect. It gets back to Gloria's very first word of her definition, John, of it is an orchestrated set of electronic services. An orchestrated set of. She led with, before she got to technology, that there is a structure, a design to this environment that makes it what it is. You take the word orchestrated out, you got a lot of stuff that I may not be able to find or use effectively.
The way we work has changed, and the way we learn is changing too. But 70% of organisations don't feel that their learning systems can really cope with all this change. It seems there is a disconnect between what learners need right now and what most learning suites provide. In a new white paper, Ben Betts and I tell the story of how this disconnect happened and lay out a vision for what a modern learning system ought to be and do. It's called Sweet Dreams, and you can read it now. Following on from that, why haven't we seen the development of EPS systems as a discrete product category? I mean, we don't hear much about them. We hear about LMS, LXP. We don't assume, Josh Burson doesn't have an EPS as part of the corporate technology stack. Are they bound by their very nature to be very custom, very specific to the organization that uses them, bespoke, as we say in the UK? And does that mean only very large organizations can have them? Or is it that we're just well enough served by generic platforms like SharePoint or chaining together with?
It's a couple things for me. I think one that it's back to it, when I work in an organization and talk about this discipline, not even the tool. They say, no, we already have that. We have SharePoint. And I go, well, it's important that we distinguish the discipline of performance support from the tools that do it. Yeah. And so I think there's been blurring for a long time because the definition has been very loose. Therefore, a tool like SharePoint, and again, I might be careful. I think I've seen SharePoint do this well, if orchestrated well, can work. But I would argue that, I could use PowerPoint to do e-learning, kinda, but why wouldn't I buy a e-learning authoring tool to do it well? Sure, SharePoint, Confluence, I've heard of many platforms that have been used well as an EPSS environment, but it's kind of square peg, round hole. It takes a really gifted designer in both of those to do it. Why wouldn't I buy an EPSS authoring environment that is designed by its nature to build these kinds of things? And I just think it's been confusion in the industry. And if I may, places where folks like Josh and others take us, and I'm not blaming them, but your point's well taken. If until that category appears, I don't know where to go, but I don't know what I don't know.
Someone said they see a lot of e-learning served up at the desktop, which I guess you would say doesn't fit the definition anyway. And, so it isn't really a serious criticism. But is there a serious danger behind that observation? How do we stop workflow learning from being an interruption of work?
I love that. That's a great question. And here's the flag I would wave. If it does, then we're not doing it right. See, workflow learning by definition is not an interruption of the workflow. It is consumed in the workflow. And this gets back to definition. In my 38 years, my friend, if I have any complaints about our industry, is we throw words around: micro learning, gamification. And often, frankly, I get it, because I was in that side of the world once, initiated by the vendor community because they have a product to sell that they love and they're defending. I'm not saying that's bad, but we put the cart ahead of the horse here. If you put 10 L&D professionals in 10 different rooms and said, define microlearning, I guarantee you will get 10 different definitions of what that is, right? So I think the danger here is that I don't think we understand what workflow learning is. It goes back to your earlier question that I think in Gloria's early effort, we got derailed by, well, why isn't making e-learning available while working workflow learning? And I would argue that that doesn't take the definition far enough. Workflow learning to me, John, is things that I can consume while I am doing my work that enable that work to be done. I don't step away cognitively, which I would argue e-learning you do, because some people say, well, look, they're still sitting at their desk. They're in the workflow physically. That's not how I delineate. To me, it's the cognitive side of the science, where if I have to stop work step out of it contextually, be it I go to a room five blocks away, or I go into a digital room like an LMS and find the course. I am no longer cognitively in my workflow. I'm in someone else's domain. When that event stops, digitally or otherwise, I have to now go, okay, back to my work. How the heck do I transfer that to changing margins in my Word document? Because that's what I was struggling with. Workflow learning, while changing those margins, would guide you through changing them. And then when I'm done, I have learned margins better, but I also have done work. And to me, in the brain science of instruction, that's nothing gets better than that, right? Learning while doing and finishing with a result, not a stage one or a simulation one right? In my life, that's been the best learning I've ever done because it's so close to the need and the context. When I have to step any degrees away from that, I have the Herculean effort of cognitively bringing it back to context. And workflow learning tries to move those sweet spots as close together as possible.
And I guess it's pretty important that it's on demand because I think, again, there is a thing that sort of people bring up all the time, which is Mr. Clippy, which again, people, you and I will remember, some people didn't, which is kind of, I can see you're trying to formulate a formula, perhaps I could, that idea of interrupting people in a kind of helpful, but actually not very helpful, go away.
Perfect.
Kind of way.
Well, you just defined that after Gloria says, it's an orchestrated set of systems that are on demand, are her very next words in her definition, in which she was very clear about that is on demand is not driven by the Clippy watching you and popping up and going, hey, I see you're writing a letter. You want help with that? No, I'm writing a letter. I need help with that. That is my on demand. Right. And so you staged it perfectly. And that's where Clippy went wrong. I think it was an early effort. But the thing it missed on was everyone turned it off, which you were given the option to do when it first appeared, because it jumped into something where you were like, I don't need help with this letter at all. I'm doing great.
Yeah.
Right. And so how do you know what I need help on? And so the second or third time it popped up, we turned it off, which is unfortunate because it had great potential. So that I love what you said, that on demand and understanding that only comes from the learner. I defined on demand intrinsically. That's not defined for me extrinsically.
So you don't drop a lot of names, other than that of Gloria Geary.
Yep.
But when I listen to you talk, I'm conscious that there's an underpinning of theory. You talk about things like
Clearly.
cognitive load and so on. You obviously know your Sweller and blah, 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 blah.
Yep.
And you talked about encoding as well. Again, cognitive psychology. So which learning theorists have been important in shaping your ideas?
Well, in more of the modern era for me, obviously, Dr. Con Gottfredson, my business partner now, has been instrumental in that. Alison Rossett, I think, post Gloria Geary and the 2 or 3 books she wrote on this, performance support and job aids and all that kinds of stuff, I think were really stood on the shoulders of the constructivists of the world, stood on the shoulders of the experientialists of the world, and which is really spaced learning. All these theories that go back, frankly, quite a ways. But one of the things that, again, this is my view on the world, is that my anxiousness about how we do sometimes stand on theory is that we don't bring it forward, right? We don't. We some of these theories are 1950s. 30s earlier, right? And they met the need of the day. And I'm not saying we should dismiss them because we're in 2020, but what I think any theorist would tell us is, my gosh, I wrote that in 1950, right? So principally bring it forward to where you are today. And that's what I think people like Gloria tried to do, Con does, Alison Rossett does. Those folks what I love about them is they are highly respectful of our legacy of theory, but they have brought it, for me, into today's context and application.
It seems to be really popular at the moment, learning theory. There is an appetite for this stuff now.
I think there's a responsibility, John. I mean, if I go to a doctor and they aren't, they're still using leeches on me, I'm going to be a bit anxious, right? But there was a time where they did that because the theory of the day, but I guarantee you, this is what, if I can run with that further, the concept of what the leech did was replaced by technology, methodology approaches, and so on that principally did that more efficiently and safely and other kinds of things, right? So I think we have a responsibility. We are called the L&D professionals, right? I think we need to be built on defendable brain science and theory. What I want to be careful of, at least what I try to be careful of in my work, is that I once got to talk to Robert Mager. I was was sitting before, I was sitting on a dais with him at a conference one time. I was literally just there with him. I was not at the caliber of the guy, but he said, here's the thing. I applaud all the accolades, but what I meant when I did that was I looked at what was right in front of me, and you have to do the same with what I thought up. I didn't know what was going to be happening today. I can't cast that out like that. We have to take those principles and reevaluate them under the context of the demand of learners today, so that we are theory based, but at the same time practically based and be open to what's new and what we're learning.
And I think that's one of the things that people really appreciate about your approach, is that it is so practical and something you can put into practice straight away. I've sort of got a bonus question here, which has occurred to me as we've been talking. Might not be a bonus, depends on your point of view of it. Sort of a pet theory of mine that we've been talking about how, the idea of learning in the flow of work has been around for a while. It's been kind of difficult to get going because that wasn't the nature of the learning technologies industry. It wasn't the nature of the way that people were interacting with LMSs and so on. And the structure of the LMS didn't seem to support those other three moments, you said. Now, my pet theory is, for what it's worth, is the problem we had is that content got separated from systems, and all the instructional design was going on within the content in the courses. And we had this unit of a course, which became an online course, and people were throwing all their ID and all their kind of knowledge of the literature at that. The people who were building the systems weren't in that. They weren't in that party.
Correct.
There's no ID really applied to the workflow that the learning systems that around the year 2000 were designed to kind of support.
Yep. Well, and there's the drawback of why SharePoint fails, I think, honestly, and why Confluence would fail, because it's a dear friend of mine once said, methodology begets technology. Yeah. I'll never forget that, John, because I made although I made many mistakes in my professional career. One huge one I made was, and I'm not going to say the vendor because it wasn't their fault. It was my fault. I got in front of the right vendor at the right time on an expo floor. I saw all the classy features, bells and whistles this thing could do. And then I brought that back. I spent a huge sum of money. I brought that tool back to my organization and thought the fact of having that tool would get us an instructional performance outcome. And guess what? It didn't, because it did not stand the instructional test that, I can buy a hammer, but if I can't swing it like a carpenter, I miss the nail. I don't get the outcome, but that you put that hammer in the hands of a carpenter and you get a remarkable outcome. And so I want to be careful here. I'm not yelling at that vendor. That vendor did what they should do. And they handed me a very powerful tool, but I, as the instructional designer, didn't apply methodology to it. Right. So that's why I say I have seen SharePoint, which a lot of people poke holes at, but I would argue SharePoint is the fault of the SharePoint designer and the users who feed that thing with all kinds of junk and don't keep it current. That's not SharePoint's fault. Right. So we have an instructional methodology we call Enable, because we have to have a name for stuff. But what Kahn realized years ago is if we don't have an ADDIE equivalent, ADDIE, if we don't have a methodology equivalent for designing workflow learning, whatever one you choose it is, we will be wielding hammers without guidance, and the technologies will fall short. And so that's the responsibility we bring. And you coined it perfectly, that with these tools, without the marriage of the methodology we bring to it, are probably going to not be used correctly and fail, frankly.
Lastly, Bob,
Yeah.
how can people follow your ideas? What's exciting you really at the moment, and where can they go to find out more about that?
Yeah, well, I love this, my friend, that you've invited me to this, but I'm sure you found the same thing. But I used to be a big blog writer and all this kinds of stuff. I love podcasts. I love what you're doing with me today, right? and this took how much prep for us to get here. And I think you've hosted a wonderful dialogue, right? And so I host a podcast series called Performance Matters. We're on our 53rd edition. We started out as the focus of our work is all in the 5momentsofneed.com with a number 5, moments of need, all one word.com. And there's videos in there and other things. But what excites me most about getting all this out there is what you and I are doing today. The immediacy of this media, the people we can get together over thousands of miles to talk to, and the focus and power of these discussions, I think is really, for me, it's the Dolly of the day. But
and we'll put a link to your podcast in the show notes, showing that we do acknowledge there are other podcasts.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Because I think podcasting isn't a broadcast medium; it's a networking medium.
It absolutely is.
And the fact that we all appear on each other's podcasts,
I know,
it's not a bad thing.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful, and I subscribe to many. So it's. But again, I don't know if you found this, but I also do think it's kind of niche in a way. What we all often do, if I may, on our side to kind of expose some of the processes, we also transcribe ours. Yeah. We put it in a blog format, and we find that there still are a huge chunk of folks that like to log in and read a blog, right, or print it out. On paper and stuff. But so the multiple medium, I think, is the approach that gets a lot of this out well.
Absolutely. And we believe the same thing around doing an audio podcast and also a YouTube version.
Yeah.
So that people can see our branding.
Yeah, there you go.
Lovely. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this today, Bob. It's been a really interesting discussion for me and I hope for everybody else as well.
Thanks for reaching out. I appreciate the opportunity to have, and thanks for hosting the conversation. I think more of these are needed. So thank you for doing that.
We'll do plenty more.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Bob and to our sponsors, Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
You can tweet me at John Helmer or contact me through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com.
Coming up on the Learning Hack.
Next episode is the last of the season before the summer break, and we're going out with a bang. Audrey Waters has written a fascinating book about the pre-computer era of learning technology called Teaching Machines, due out in August 2021. Central to the story is the controversial behaviourist B.F. Skinner. This one is not to be missed. Till next time.
Stay in the flow, learning people.
Now I finally get it.